Imagine this: two innocent twins, full of potential, walking into a classroom just like any other day. But what happens next will leave you speechless. In a moment that shocks everyone, a teacher, who's supposed to nurture and guide them, humiliates them for something beyond their control: being black. What could possibly drive an educator to cross such a line? As the seconds tick by, you can feel the tension building. The twins, devastated by the hurtful words, stand there struggling to comprehend the cruelty directed at them. But the story doesn't end there. The very teacher who belittled them, moments later, finds herself in an unimaginable situation. The tables turn, and suddenly, it's the teacher who's begging for mercy. How did this dramatic shift happen? What went down in that classroom that led to such a stunning change? Stick around to find out the truth behind this unbelievable twist, because this isn't just about a teacher and her students. It's about standing up, finding strength, and facing the consequences of cruelty. Stay tuned to uncover the full story. To understand what led to this jaw-dropping moment, we need to take a step back. The twins, Jamal and Jasmine, had always been the quiet ones in class: bright, kind-hearted, and well-behaved. They kept to themselves, never looking for trouble. But it seemed their teacher, Mrs. Thompson, had her own biases that went unnoticed by many. On the surface, she was the perfect educator, stern but fair, or so it seemed. But there was a side to her that, until that day, no one had seen. For weeks, Jamal and Jasmine had felt the subtle shift in the classroom atmosphere. Small comments here and there, looks exchanged between Mrs. Thompson and other students, it all added up. They didn't know what to make of it at first. They just wanted to fit in and be treated like everyone else. But one fateful afternoon, it all came crashing down. Mrs. Thompson's words that day were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. The twins were humiliated in front of their peers for simply being who they were. It was like everything they'd worked for, the respect, the friendships, meant nothing in that moment. But as the bell rang and the students left, something unexpected started to happen. The day after the humiliating incident, Jamal and Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers from their classmates, the sideways glances, they all seemed to confirm what they had suspected. They were no longer just students in Mrs. Thompson's class. They were targets. They talked quietly to each other during lunch, trying to make sense of what had happened. Jasmine, usually the more optimistic twin, suggested that maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But Jamal wasn't so sure. He had seen the way Mrs. Thompson had looked at them. Her eyes narrowed with something darker than mere frustration. It wasn't just about being late to class or answering a question wrong. This felt personal. Later that afternoon, they overheard some of the other kids talking about it. They didn't know everything, but the word was out. Mrs. Thompson had made a joke about Jamal's hair and Jasmine's attitude. The more they pieced together, the clearer it became. The teacher's prejudice wasn't just a one-time slip. It was a pattern. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson, too, seemed to sense the growing tension. She noticed the way the classroom dynamics had shifted after that day. Her once friendly rapport with the students had turned icy, and her actions were being scrutinized. She tried to act normal, but she couldn't ignore the weight of what she'd done, or the feeling that something was about to snap. Little did she know, her moment of cruelty was about to come back to haunt her in ways she could never have imagined. The tension in the classroom had reached its peak. Jumal and Jasmine could feel it in every glance, every comment that was made in hushed tones behind their backs. They tried to block it out, focusing on their schoolwork, but it was impossible to ignore the ripple of hostility that had settled over Mrs. Thompson's class. They weren't just students anymore. They were under constant surveillance, the target of whispers and judgment from their classmates. As the days dragged on, things started to unravel for Mrs. Thompson. Her usual authoritative presence began to falter. She stumbled over her words in class, avoided eye contact with the twins, and appeared more agitated with every passing minute. It wasn't just the atmosphere in the classroom that was changing. The twins had noticed that some of the other teachers were starting to watch her more closely. Even the principal had been visiting the classroom more often, although it wasn't clear why. But it wasn't just her colleagues that were beginning to take notice. Jamal had overheard something that sent a chill down his spine. One of the students had caught a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson's personal files on her desk, where her biases were written in plain black and white. It was like a secret no one was supposed to know, and it was all about to come to light. That afternoon, a small group of students gathered in the back of the class, their eyes fixed on Mrs. Thompson. They had heard the rumors, pieced together the signs, and they were ready to confront the truth. But just as they started to whisper among themselves, Mrs. Thompson turned around sharply, her face pale, her hands shaking. The clock on the wall ticked louder with every second, and for the first time, she looked truly vulnerable. The door to the classroom clicked open, and a voice from the hallway echoed through the tense silence, one that would change everything. As the door creaked open, the students froze. Mrs. Thompson's face went white, and for a moment, no one moved. Then from the doorway, a figure stepped into the classroom, none other than the principal, Mr. Harris. But he wasn't alone. He had another teacher with him, someone Jamal and Jasmine had never seen before. The man had a stern look on his face, his arms crossed tightly. The principal's gaze swept across the room, landing on Mrs. Thompson with an intensity that made everyone hold their breath. The tension was palpable. Mrs. Thompson straightened up, her voice trembling as she tried to muster an explanation, but Mr. Harris cut her off before she could say anything. "We need to talk, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone colder than usual. The room went silent. The students exchanged confused glances. No one knew what was happening, but the sense of something huge about to unfold was impossible to ignore. Jumal's heart pounded as he exchanged a quick look with Jasmine. Was this it? Had someone finally figured out what was going on? But then, just as quickly, the second twist hit. Mr. Harris didn't speak to Mrs. Thompson about her behavior toward the twins. Instead, he turned to Jamal and Jasmine, his expression unreadable. "Jamal, Jasmine," he began, his voice steady but serious. "We need to have a word with you as well." The room seemed to close in around them. What was happening? The tension in the air was unbearable. Had their actions somehow triggered something bigger than they could ever have imagined? The question hung over them, unanswered, as the principal motioned for them to follow him outside the classroom. As Jumal and Jasmine walked out of the classroom, their hearts raced. The hallway was eerily quiet, the heavy footsteps of Mr. Harris and the unfamiliar teacher echoing through the empty space. What could this be about? They had no idea what was happening, but it felt like their entire world was about to shift. Mr. Harris led them into his office, where they stood awkwardly in front of his desk. The other teacher, a man they didn't recognize, stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching them intently. Jumal tried to stay calm, but the silence was deafening. Jasmine's voice broke the tension. "What's going on, Mr. Harris? Why are we here?" The principal took a deep breath, his eyes glancing at the teacher before turning back to the twins. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Jumal, Jasmine, your teacher, Mrs. Thompson, has been making some serious mistakes. And it's not just about you two." Jamal felt a knot in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "The school has received a report about racial bias, inappropriate behavior in the classroom. It's been happening for months, and we've been investigating it quietly." Mr. Harris paused, looking at them both carefully. What we didn't know, and what we've just discovered, is that you two weren't the only ones suffering. Jasmine's face paled. What do you mean? The teacher by the door spoke up, his voice unexpectedly soft. It turns out Mrs. Thompson has been treating several students unfairly, but because of her position, it wasn't easy to prove. Jamal felt his heart skip a beat. So you knew? Mr. Harris nodded. We knew something wasn't right, but we needed solid evidence. The way Mrs. Thompson targeted you two, it gave us the breakthrough we needed. Just as they began to process this, the principal's phone buzzed. He looked down, his expression shifting from one of concern to shock. Wait, there's something else. He turned the phone toward them. The screen displayed a news headline. Asterisk local teacher exposed for racist behavior in schools. Asterisk, the headline wasn't what shocked them. It was the image that accompanied it. There on the front page was Mrs. Thompson. But next to her, in the background of the photo, was the mysterious teacher who had been standing in the office. Jamal's eyes widened. That's him. That's the guy from the door. Mr. Harris' face grew even more serious. This was no random teacher. The man you see there is actually a reporter, undercover. He's been working with the school district for weeks to expose deeper corruption within the system. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just targeting you two. She was part of something much bigger. And it was all about to be revealed. The weight of the truth hit them like a ton of bricks. Mrs. Thompson's actions weren't isolated. They were part of a widespread issue the school had been hiding. But the final twist came when they learned that the reporter wasn't just revealing Mrs. Thompson's behavior. He had also been gathering evidence on several other teachers. And Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only one about to face the consequences. The room fell silent again, but this time, the tension wasn't just about fear. It was about justice. As the truth came to light, Jamal and Jasmine felt a mix of relief and disbelief. The investigation that had been silently unfolding behind the scenes had finally exposed the ugly reality they'd been living with. Mrs. Thompson was removed from her position, and several other teachers were also placed under investigation. The school district promised swift action, with training on bias and discrimination to prevent this from happening again. Jamal and Jasmine knew that their experience had sparked something bigger, something that could help future students avoid the pain they had endured. For the twins, the journey wasn't easy. But they learned that standing up, even when it seemed impossible, could lead to change. They felt proud knowing they had not only stood up for themselves, but had also helped others find their voice. As the days passed, the school began to heal. Students who had witnessed the injustices came forward, sharing their own stories and demanding accountability. What started as an act of cruelty turned into a movement for justice, all because the truth was finally exposed. For Jamal and Jasmine, the road ahead wasn't without challenges, but they had learned the power of standing together and never backing down. The lesson they took with them was clear. In the face of injustice, silence is never the answer.